Hey everyone, so I wanted to talk a little bit about picking the right soundbite for your story. We've covered some of this previously in classes, and I really can't stress enough how important quality sound is for your stories. It really can make or break a good story into a great story. You can make a good story into a bad story. So, uh, picking quality sound is of the utmost importance in broadcast writing. So, some of the things we're going to talk about today. Uh, Finding the people to interview shouldn't be that difficult for you. Hopefully, you've reached that point by now. But filtering out the nuggets of usable sound that they give you, that is a little bit more challenging. So, hopefully, by the end of this, you'll have a little bit better idea. So, the first thing you'll want to do is review your notes as soon as you're done. Hopefully, this will get easier and easier as time goes on because you're going to start to recognize those usable quotes or usable sound as the person is saying them. Remember, we talked in class, you're going to have those aha moments when you hear someone that you're going to instantly recognize, okay, that's a great soundbite, that's a great soundbite, that's my closing bite. That could be a possible bite to use early in the show, that could be a tease bite. You'll begin to recognize these things. So that's the first thing I will tell you. Some people like to write down a time code, especially if you're just using audio on your phone. You can look and see, that person said it at so and so time. It helps you review your notes quicker and go through the sound and pick the best sound bites. But I will give you a warning with that. You don't want that to become a distraction because the person you're talking to is going to notice that you're constantly looking at your phone or constantly looking at the camera and writing notes down, and this can cause them to pause while they're talking. It can cause them to wonder if you're paying attention. So it really is a science to doing this. So, this might be something you want to practice at home and just kind of take general notes as you're going along. And then as you start getting better and better at it, then you can start getting more scientific with it. And it really will speed up your post sound time in terms of breaking down an interview and finding those 4 or 5 or 6 usable sound bites from it. So what are the types of sound bites? This isn't an exact science by any means, but these are the types that you typically will see in an interview. I'm going to start at the bottom and work the way up. Sometimes people try to be funny in interviews. Sometimes this works. Most of the time, it can be a train wreck. So when somebody's really trying to be funny, you have to remember not everyone's going to get that joke. Someone may not understand the frame of reference. So you have to be really careful when you're trying to use someone's humor in your story. Now, if it fits the tone of your story, by all means use it. But for the most part, when someone's trying to crack a joke, just know that there are probably people out there who aren't going to get the joke. You're going to have the factual sound bites. These typically come from a public relations person, a spokesperson. Remember, they're there to make their client or their employer look good. So the word facts, as I wrote there, might be a little misleading. Sometimes, they could outright just be hiding a fact from you because it's the goal. That's their job to make their client look as good as possible. So from a quality sound perspective, these types of sound bites are typically boring. Sometimes you're going to have spokespeople who are really great on camera, and if that's the situation, perfect. I used to have a school spokesperson in San Antonio. It was one of the best sound bites we ever had, and if we had to use him, that was great. But for the most part, they're not good sound bites. And so you really want the people involved rather than a spokesperson. So moving the way up, the type of sound bites, you're going to have sometimes people who take a stand on camera. And when this happens, it's usually a pretty good soundbite. But most people won't take a hard opinion on camera. They kind of freeze up a little bit. They get nervous. But if you get someone who's fired up and has emotion, by all means, that might be something you want to use in your story. Speaking of emotion, most emotional sound bites are good sound bites. The types of sound where emotion gets a little hard, sometimes you'll get, a mom or a dad that's crying so hard and you can't understand a word they're saying. So in that sense, emotion has kind of overtaken the sound. But for the most part, 99 or 95% of the time, emotion is good. You're going to want that in your story, and people are going to connect to those sound bites more. The final type of sound bite I'll talk about is, I just call it the one. You could call it whatever you want, but it may not happen every interview. But once you start recognizing quality sound, you're going to eventually start hearing the holy crap moment of, that was a great soundbite. You might have more than one per interview, but if you get one every couple of interviews, that's probably a pretty good ratio. These don't happen often, but they're fantastic sound. They're sound, it's sound that you're going to use in a tease. It's sound you're going to use high up in your story. You might use it toward the close to really hammer home. These are your money sound bites, and you will begin to recognize these when you start getting better with tracking your sound as the interview is happening. So we just mentioned the great sound. What happens if your sound isn't very great, or it may not even be good or okay? This happens. It's a fact of life that not all sound bites are going to be great. Not all interviews are great. Thankfully for the stories you're going to be writing for this class, a lot of times you're going to be talking to students. So we have 35,000 students on campus. So if that one student you talk to wasn't very good, go find somebody else. But you might be in a situation when you're in a newsroom where you have one person who you can talk to for that story. So what do you do if they're not a good soundbite? Then you have a couple decisions to make. If that person is really necessary to the story, you might have to get creative. I don't mean creative in terms of editing their sound or making them sound better than they really are, but you might have to get creative in your storytelling process. Maybe you just use a really quick soundbite and then paraphrase. Maybe you use statements from them as opposed to them on camera if they have a lisp or if they stutter or if they just have a hard time getting a coherent thought in terms of audio, but the thought behind it makes sense, if that's clear. You might have to change your storytelling process in order to accommodate that person's presence in your story. And then, like I mentioned, if that person isn't necessary to the story and it's a bad interview, go find someone else. Be polite, though, to that person. Don't just up and leave the interview and say they suck. Let them answer a couple of questions. Tell them thank you and say that's it. That's all I got. And thank them for their time, and move on to somebody else. You don't want to waste their time. You don't want to waste your time, but you also want to be polite since that person did stop and offer to help you with a story. So if the person's absolutely necessary and not all that great a sound, get creative with your storytelling practices. Use some tools. If the person isn't necessary, just move on. Find somebody else. So a few other things to consider. Soundbite length. I've talked about this a couple times in class. The typical soundbite goes about 10 to 15 seconds. 15 seconds is really about the max that you want a soundbite, and that's pushing it. So if you have a soundbite that's longer than 15 seconds, you either need to chop from the beginning or the end, or you need to find another way to have that soundbite in your story. You might have to pick another soundbite. Like I have here on the screen, you can have the world's greatest soundbite, but if it's 30 seconds long, it's not making a story. That's half your story right there. So the whole purpose of sound is to add some color, add some flavor to your story, but they can't overtake your story. Also, you have to wonder might be the wrong word. You have to recognize if the person rambles, kind of like what I just did right there. If a person just goes on and on and on and on and on, without ever stopping and taking a breath or ending a coherent thought and moving on to another one, you might have to pick a nugget from that really, really long soundbite, because you're obviously not going to want a minute long clip of someone rambling on about school finance or something like that. You're going to need to find a little 5-second clip somewhere in the middle of there and use that if that person is necessary to the story. Also, as we mentioned, keep in mind how a person sounds or looks on TV. We're not in the business of making people look stupid. We're also not in the business of coaching people. But, I know I typically would help somebody if their collar was messed up. I would point out, or if they had a huge hair sticking up and alfalfa in the back. Um, you know, keep that in mind, that um, this person is probably helping you and y'all have a relationship now. And so if they're going to be in your story, you don't want your story distracted because people are giggling at home because the person has, a massive cowlick at the back of their head or something like that. So it falls on you for a little bit, or partly, to help with the way they look. Um, you also want to keep in mind how someone sounds, especially in radio where you don't have a mental image to go along with it. If the person has an incredibly high, squeaky voice, probably not going to be the best sound, even if they have a great statement or great, words to say. The sound is just going to be too distracting. And it's kind of a sad statement, but it's the truth. So keep those in mind when you are working on picking your quality sound.